The person I have the honor of introducing this evening is somebody whose work I've read for a very long time and never imagined I would work with him, never imagined I would meet him, in fact. Reading his essays, his superbly intelligent and humorful essays in the New Republic, I came to admire him greatly, and lo and behold, one day he arrives at Boston College and informs me almost immediately that his grandfather's name, was it grandfather?
Grandfather. Yeah.
Grandfather's name was Ben Birnbaum. And so we have had a mutual admiration society ever since. I sometimes play his grandfather on the phone just to make sure he's behaving well. Alan is a professor of political science, director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. His most recent books include the subject of tonight's discussion, Return to Greatness, How America Lost Its Sense of Purpose and What It Needs to Do to Recover, which is the longest title he's ever used. The Transformation of American Religion, How We Actually Practice Our Faith, which is the next longest title. Which, I'm going backwards in time, by the way, which means his next book is likely to be 30 words long by way of title. He is also the author of a book that I love particularly. It's called Marginalized in the Middle, and it's a collection of his essays. I have to say it dropped like a stone when it was published, and maybe collections of essays are supposed to drop like stones, but it's the kind of book you pick up at night when you're in despair, and you read it, and there's a purposeful, intelligent voice talking to you, and it's a wonderful solace. Also the author of One Nation After All, Moral Freedom, etc. One Nation After All and Moral Freedom were selected as New York Times Notable Books of the Year. Alan is mentioned as a contributing editor of the New Republic, also the Wilson Quarterly, and he writes for many other publications. I am very pleased to welcome you here this evening and to welcome our guest and presenter, Professor Alan Wolfe.
Thank you, Grandpa. For those of you who came in late, just forget about that. I just want to tell you a little bit about the book, and then I won't speak for a very long period of time, and then I hope we can discuss this, what I have to say, and hope you'll have some questions about it. This book got its start, really, in the 2000 presidential election. After the 2000 presidential election, I'm sure you all remember the 2000 presidential election with all the ruckus in Florida and the hanging chads and the people pouring over every ballot and so on. And a lot of people felt that something dramatic had happened at that time. Some major turning point in American history was experienced in those events in Florida in 2000. And I'm certainly of that opinion that the entire 2000 election really did represent a transformation, a changing point in the nature of our country, which we're still trying to figure out, we're still trying to wrestle with. But almost unlike, I'm sure unlike everybody else, I'm not at all concerned about the hanging chads in Florida and the fact that the Supreme Court decided the election rather than the American people, or that the Electoral College had a different winner than the popular vote, and all those other things that everyone else talks about. I mean, that's talked about endlessly. The cliffhanger between Bush and Gore. I'm much more interested in actually a prior question, and that is, how did Bush and Gore happen to become the two candidates of the two leading parties in the 2000 presidential election? It's almost completely forgotten, but both of them had opposition in their respective primaries. Al Gore was challenged by Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey, and George W. Bush was challenged by John McCain, senator from Arizona. And there was at least a brief period of time where I deluded myself into thinking that in the year 2000 we were going to have a presidential election between Bill Bradley and John McCain. We actually wound up having one between Al Gore and George W. Bush. And that actually strikes me as the much more interesting story, because both Bill Bradley and John McCain were very interesting figures, and both seemed to symbolize the death of two of the most important political traditions that existed in the United States. Bill Bradley is a liberal Democrat from the northeastern part of the United States. And no liberal Democrat from the northeastern part of the United States evidently can be elected president of this country anymore. He couldn't get the nomination. John F. Kerry from our state, of course, got the nomination in 2004 and lost. But the only Democrats that have been elected to the presidency for a significant period of time now are Southerners. And there's been a propensity in the Democratic Party to choose Southern candidates. And in that sense, Al Gore, representing the state of Tennessee, although he never actually really lived in Tennessee, but his father was a distinguished senator from that state, and he called it his home state, although he couldn't win it in the presidential election, and if he had, he'd be president now. But Al Gore beat Bill Bradley, and in that sense, it sort of makes, or at least made me wonder, not that, I actually worked with Bradley and advised him and wanted him to get the nomination, but I think that's besides the point. I mean, and whatever you think of Bill Bradley and whether he would have been a successful president or not, something about the idea of a kind of, for lack of a better word, a patrician New Englander or Northeasterner standing for the tradition of leadership that has produced a kind of leadership class in America seemed to go out. The wind seemed to go out of that balloon with Bradley's defeat by Gore, at least in my opinion. Because most of our great Democratic presidents have been from New England or from the northeastern part of the United States. They've had a background like Bradley's. They've been part of a kind of leadership class in the United States. Haven't necessarily been the most populistic in their appeals, and they don't sort of talk Southern and all those other things that politicians do these days. But for a Democrat, it would seem that the lesson is that representing that kind of style, that kind of political style, is a political loser in the United States. And it's, who knows, who the Democratic Party will bring forward in the future. And there is a potential candidate from New York State on the Democratic Party's horizon. She, of course, would raise the issue of whether a woman, as well as a New Yorker, can be elected president. But we'll see what happens. But, I think there's an interesting story in there, in the fact that Bradley couldn't achieve the nomination of the party. And I think there's a similar interesting story in the fact that McCain lost to Bush in the Republican primaries. John McCain, representing Arizona, which is a relatively new state, one of the last of the 50 states to join the Union. But John McCain sort of really embodying a tradition of Theodore Roosevelt kind of republicanism, a tradition in which serving in the military is an important part of one's credentials toward public office. Becoming a war hero is part of one's credentials for public office. Embodying the spirit of sacrifice that military service entails, the spirit of sacrifice for one's country, of serving one's country, all those ideals which had been so much part of the more patrician tradition of the Republican Party and really did seem to crystallize in the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, who was, after all, a Republican, although he finally did break with his party as it took a direction different from the one he was advocating. But it seemed that in 2000, not only was the Northeast New England leadership wing of the Democratic Party in disarray, but so was the patrician, more socially liberal, more upper-class oriented tradition of service that had been embodied in the Republican Party. And so both McCain and Bradley lost, and two Southerners ran against each other for President of the United States. And in that sense, I think that's the most interesting story, because forget about the hanging chads and so on. The election was over before Florida happened, in the sense that the kinds of traditions in American life that stand for an idea of national greatness had already been determined that the two candidates who best embodied the idea of American national greatness were simply not going to be on the ballot, and therefore you couldn't vote for them as president. Now, what is this thing called national greatness? Well, that's essentially what my book is about. I go back throughout the American history and try to develop what I think are the essential ingredients in a platform that stands for the ideal of national greatness. I see national greatness embodied in three primary characteristics. One is a willingness to establish a sense of purpose for America, a sense of what America stands for, some ideal that the country and its values are meant to embody, particularly the ideas of both liberty and equality, which have been so essential to our history throughout the 18th and 19th and 20th century. So taking and fleshing out and giving life to a conception of what liberty and equality mean under contemporary circumstances, so that America stands for something, something that Americans can understand, something that Americans can identify with and resonate with, seems to be one essential criterion of an idea of national greatness. The second is much more important because words in politics are relatively cheap. The second and the really crucial factor in establishing a program of national greatness is standing for some way, some actual real means of accomplishing the ideals of liberty or equality that one embodies in one's speeches and in one's rhetoric. And that means in particular standing for the notion that we as Americans are part of a common nation, that we share operative and equal conceptions of national citizenship, and that we realize the purposes for which we stand through the only available collective agency that can embody our collective will, and that is government. So being favorably disposed toward government with the understanding that only government can take our ideals and transform them into actual living realities that influence and shape how we live is a second crucial feature of national greatness in the United States. And then a third crucial feature is the willingness to embody that idea of liberty and equality abroad when circumstances demand it, not to retreat within a kind of fortress America or an isolationist sense that we are different and not obligated to address the problems that the rest of the world faces. Carrying forward some kind of commitment that American power, which has its dangers, also has its positive sides, that American power can be used in the world as a force to embody the ideals that are so valuable at home. Because it seems to me inevitably that there's a dimension of universality to the notion of American greatness, that if you believe these ideals are good for Americans, you ought to believe that they're good for others as well. There are, of course, all kinds of problems of how you realize that, but it seems to me at least a willingness to consider the United States as a global power, and a global power with global obligations is an essential ingredient in the idea of national greatness as well. Now, it may sound like, I mean, every time politicians speak, they speak about greatness, and everyone imagines that the United States is, at least all of our politicians make routine references to how great we are. But I argue in the book that greatness, as I've just defined it, is actually a kind of minority taste throughout the history of American politics and throughout American political culture. Greatness, as I've defined it, is the exception rather than the rule. The notion that we should embody concrete ideas of liberty and equality has had far more opponents than it's had supporters in American politics. In particular, the idea that we should rely upon the notion of equal national citizenship and that use government and with government pay the taxes necessary to support realizing those ideas in practice has by far been the minority position in American politics. And finally, the notion that we should be a cosmopolitan and global power with global obligations and take those obligations seriously has also run against the grain of American culture throughout most of our political history. So greatness has been much more the exception rather than the rule. In fact, there is another way of thinking about America and its purpose that has been the dominant one, in our tradition at least, so I argue in the book, and that is what I call the idea of American goodness. A good portion of my book tries to contrast the idea of American greatness with the idea of American goodness. Goodness, the idea that we should not necessarily strive to be great, but that we should always strive to be good, seems to me to have been really the fundamental disposition of most of our political leaders throughout most of our history. In this vision, America has an obligation to be virtuous before it is anything else. That America embodies a conception of goodness, whether that is derived from a religious ideal or whether it's derived from a secular ideal, is less important than the notion that we are special, we are exceptional, we stand for things that other people do not. In America's original understanding of itself, It was Europe that was seen as a decadent and corrupt society, a society that was surrounded with trappings of power, monarchies and finery and decadence and all the aristocratic vices. Whereas we stood for the good democratic virtues. We would be pure at heart rather than to be a great power, the way great powers have been understood throughout the history of European monarchy and aristocratic societies. So we would stand apart from the world. We would do what's best for ourselves. We would try to show the world through our example. That we certainly would do. The whole world would presumably be interested in our experiment because our experiment was so special. But we could not expect other people to be as good as we were. Goodness is something reserved, particularly for Americans, and that Americans embody best. Now, I suggest in the book that while there is a great deal of words that we use to try to characterize how we think about politics in the United States, especially words like liberal and conservative or Republican and democratic, that there's this other fault line, that there's been a fault line in American life over this idea of whether we should strive to goodness or try to achieve greatness. And that this crosses all of our usual ideological categories. In my understanding of the world, it was conservatives, primarily, in the earliest parts of our history, who embodied the idea of greatness, and our more liberal or leftist or whatever you want to call it, thinkers who stood for goodness. You can certainly see this in the famous and ongoing interpretation of the fundamental differences between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. With Hamilton, the conservative, standing for the idea of America as a cosmopolitan great power in the world, and Jefferson standing for the idea of America as a virtuous, more agrarian, less cosmopolitan, more inward-looking society. In fact, throughout much of the 19th century, the great thinkers who embodied, and politicians who embodied the idea of American greatness were almost invariably conservatives. John Marshall, who the third Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, who tried in his Supreme Court decisions to essentially create an American nation almost by judicial fiat, who had an idea of what it meant to have a nation, much earlier than almost any of our leading jurists, and what it would mean if we had a nation, what our commerce would look like if we had a nation, what our people would look like if we had a nation. Meeting resistance at every quarter, and particularly resistance from people more focused on America, not necessarily as a nation, but as a collection of regions for whom sectional loyalties were much, much more important than any kind of sense of national citizenship. So we have Alexander Hamilton, we have John Marshall, we have Abraham Lincoln, another Republican at least, and I think someone fundamentally conservative in his basic political disposition, whose magnificent speeches and actions put concrete meaning for the first time in American life behind the idea of equality and what it would mean to actually take equality seriously as a national ideal, what it would mean for us, what it would mean for our experiment with slavery, which of course would have to be abolished if that idea were to be realized, what it would mean for the idea of equal process before the law, which the 14th Amendment, which was the first really constitutional document to embody the notion of national citizenship in the United States, which the 14th Amendment established. What this new nation would look like. There aren't that many words in the Gettysburg Address, but the word nation is there 4 times. 4 times Abraham Lincoln used the word nation. And the word had not been really used very much in America before Lincoln appropriated it. Daniel Webster, another great advocate of national greatness for the United States, almost never used the word nation. He preferred the word union. It was Lincoln who really took the idea of a nation and began to flesh it out and to give it meaning. And of course, as my introductory comments suggest, Theodore Roosevelt was probably the last of the Republican presidents to embody this idea of national greatness. So for a long period of American history, national greatness, as I'm talking about it, was an idea associated with the Republican Party and an idea associated with the more conservative elements in American society. That's now changed. For the next 100 years, since from Roosevelt's time to our own, the political balance has shifted the other way. Now it's much more the Democratic Party that stands for the idea of national citizenship, that stands for the idea that government should be active on behalf of individuals, that we have international obligations abroad that we have to take seriously. This is now an idea that we associate almost invariably throughout the 20th century with the Democratic Party and with the more liberal elements of American political life. Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course, would have to be included in any such rendering of the greatness tradition in American life. There were the echoes of Roosevelt certainly carried down throughout the 1960s. We have no way of knowing whether Brookline's own John F. Kennedy would have wound up achieving American greatness, but we certainly know that he was very, very attracted to the idea rhetorically, and that his speeches were filled with invocations of that ideal and so on. So what I'm trying to suggest then is this idea of greatness is really a nonpartisan idea. It has a history in which both political parties have embodied it at different periods of time. It has a history in which it was once thought of as a conservative notion resisted by the left, and now has much more recently had a history of being associated with liberals and much more resisted by the right. The same is true of the goodness tradition in American life, which has its origins in Jefferson and in ideas about Republican virtue and some of the ideas of the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were a fairly conservative group of people, but they actually were honored by later generations of radicals for protesting against some of the evils that were seen with bigness and with nationalism. One of Massachusetts' great citizens, Henry David Thoreau, I would certainly include in the pantheon of people who advocated goodness rather than greatness. Fear of centralizing power, fear of what the demands of a nation would really mean, who identified much more with the idea of virtue and the idea of pursuing goodness, who didn't want to compromise with politics and compromise with power because purity of heart was so central to his way of understanding the world. So the goodness tradition in the 19th century is identified with some of our more radical thinkers. I mean, Thoreau is generally considered a pretty radical thinker in American life. Whereas in the 20th century, just as there's a shift in the political background behind the greatness ideal, there's also a shift in the goodness ideal as well. It's much more the case that you hear the fear of big government and you hear ideas that sound very Thoreauian coming from the right wing of the political spectrum rather than the left these days. I have a preference, as I hope it's already clear in this distinction that I'm making. I teach at a Catholic university, and it's a faith-based institution in its own way, so you'll forgive me, I hope, if I'm dubious about goodness and in favor of greatness. I'm all for goodness in leading one's life and in the private realm, but I think goodness gets us into serious trouble when we pursue it as a political objective. And so my book tries to make an argument for greatness rather than goodness. Now, surely you might think we would have both. Why not try to have both? Be good and the great at the same time. And I guess in theory there's no reason why we can't. We do, however, have an unfortunate example of someone who tried to do both, Woodrow Wilson, who both embodied a kind of Presbyterian-based religious vision of what the world should be like with a kind of great power, responsibility, and was really torn apart. I mean, I don't want to attribute all of Woodrow Wilson's failings to my particular little dichotomy that I'm developing in this book, but it does seem to me that Wilson illustrates how difficult it is to pursue both of these objectives at the same time. They really do go in different directions. They really have different underlying conceptions of who we are. And just to illustrate that briefly, and then I'll make some concluding remarks about the present time. One of the things I try and do in the book is to contrast goodness and greatness, not so much on public policy questions. I'm not that interested in like who's in favor of tariffs and who isn't, or which of these two supports the Sherman Antitrust Act and which doesn't. I'm much more interested in the kind of underlying, almost philosophical issues that are associated with these two different perspectives. I talk a lot about that in the book. I talk, for example, about how goodness and greatness have very different conceptions of human nature. For the goodness people, for those who put goodness first, oddly enough, people are almost uniformly bad. There is a sense that people are inherently evil among those who talk about goodness as our first requirement, that we have to be suspicious of human nature, that human nature will lead, human beings will pursue what's easiest for them, what's most sinful for them, that we have to constantly protect ourselves against the inherent flaws of human beings. Whereas the other school is much given to talking about confidence and talking about how we can trust, unleash people's energies without fear of that. Probably the single greatest book written in American political history that embodies the greatness ideal is a book that aficionados of political history constantly refer to. It's called The Promise of American Life, and it was written by Herbert Croly, an advisor to Theodore Roosevelt. And the promise, the very word promise in the title of this book suggests that for the greatness people, there's promise, there's confidence, there's spirit, there's energy. Energy was kind of Kennedy's favorite word, that it's a question of motion, it's a question of movement, whereas for the other school, it's like distrust, cynicism, go slow, you can't really expect too much, and so on. And I try to draw out these differences in how they operate. I'm also really struck by how the goodness school and the greatness school have a very, very different way of thinking about what governs us as human beings. Are we governed by fixed laws, by systematic ways of thinking? Are we enmeshed in a system of fixed rules? Almost all of the people who talk about goodness also talk about principle and how important principle is and how we have to be guided by fixed principle. Underlying, for example, one strain in the goodness school are notions that of literalism, that the Bible is literally true. It establishes literal truths, then we follow those literal truths, or that the Constitution, as it's originally written and as it was originally intended, constitutes a set of principles that we should guide ourselves by. I said that probably Herbert Croly is the greatest thinker in the goodness and in the greatness strain in American political history. Overwhelmingly the greatest thinker in the goodness strain in American political history is John C. Calhoun, former Vice President of the United States, and probably, with the exception of James Madison, our greatest political philosopher in our history. And Calhoun, who once said that he would sacrifice anything to save the Union except his principles, that his principles came before the country. Calhoun was a systematizer who developed an elaborate system of checks and balances and so on. You have fixed rules, economic theory, laissez-faire, fixed rules that guide us. Whereas the greatness people are experimentalists. And running throughout all their ideas is rules are there to be broken. There's always exceptions. You should be guided by experience. Very, very important to the greatness tradition is the American philosophical tradition of pragmatism, which suggests that there are no fixed rules, that experimentation, adjustments to reality are constantly part of what we need to do. So I could go on these philosophical points, but I won't. I just wanted to give you some sense of what's in the book. Now, I started with the election, so I ought to come back for a few moments to the current political situation. I guess Besides the 2000 election, another relatively current event that went into the making of this book was something that I'm sure you remember very, very well. We all remember. We probably even remember exactly where we were when we first began to see the pictures coming from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq that proved that American troops had been engaged in the torture of Iraqi citizens. It was just one of those searing moments. It was a kind of confrontation with us. I mean, Americans had to confront themselves. Who are we as Americans? What is being done in our name? And I'll never forget the president's reaction. Because President Bush went on television and said, fascinating, I thought absolutely fascinating what he said. He said, "We don't do this." That was essentially what he said. We don't do this. Now, the picture showed that we did, in fact, do it. I actually think the president was probably sincere when he said that we don't do this, because the president was so convinced that we as Americans are so good, that our motives are so honorable, that we stand for such good things, that when confronted with evidence that we had done bad things, it was almost inconceivable that that represented America. And I think the president was embodying the sense that America is special, America is blessed, America stands for goodness. I'm not at all surprised that the president's rhetoric has been so Wilsonian. It surprises a lot of people. I'm not that surprised. People say, hey, there's this Republican president who's using the language of a former Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, in all of his speeches, and doesn't that represent the fact that something has changed in American political culture? But I don't see it that way at all. I see Bush as fundamentally in the goodness camp in American life, and not that I mean by that he's good or that he's a good man. That's open for discussion. But that when he talks and when he thinks in line with a series of thinkers that I try to describe in my book, who are suspicious of human nature, who are wary of using government for any large sense of purpose, who stand against the fundamental notion that the nation state embodies the ideal of citizenship, and that the nation state is the only agency that can make us all equal with one another. It doesn't surprise me again that the president has decided to make as the main linchpin of his domestic policy an attack on the Social Security system. It surprises a lot of people. Social Security was usually considered what we call the third rail of American politics, and politicians weren't supposed to touch it. Bush came into office in second term. Social Security had never been mentioned in the campaign against Kerry. It wasn't an issue. There was no mandate for it. And suddenly there's Bush saying that we're going to privatize Social Security. And everyone was a little shocked and said, well, why is he doing that? Now it turns out that doing it is probably going to be Bush's downfall. It's wildly unpopular, and he's not going to be able to do it. But why would this guy, who's so politically smart, I second to none in my admiration for Bush's political skills, why would this guy take on Social Security, which seems now like a total loser? And I think it was because he genuinely understood that Social Security was the greatest thing that ever happened in domestic politics in the history of the United States. That Social Security embodies the ideal of American greatness more than any other single piece of legislation. Social Security says that at some minimum level, every single American will have a standard of equality with every other American, that it can't be taken away, that nothing can stop it, that we are all treated equally in the eyes of the law, and that government is a mechanism for ensuring that no American will ever suffer the indignities of extreme poverty in old age. It is, in that sense, the literal embodiment of the Lincoln-esque, Marshall-esque ideal of national citizenship as embodied through government. And Bush knows that he simply has to destroy it. He has to destroy it because it is such a great thing. That he cannot stand for his program, which is a program that has a long history in the United States, a social Darwinist vision of every individual attacking or competing with every other individual, a program that views government as an enemy rather than a friend of liberty and equality, that he simply cannot achieve those objectives and let Social Security stand. And so if there's proof that Bush belongs in the one camp rather than the other, that seems to me to be the overwhelming proof. And even in foreign policy, I'm pretty persuaded that although the president, as I said, is one who seems to be embodying, taking fundamental American ideas of freedom and liberty and guaranteeing to other people in the world, and to some degree has done that, thus far in Iraq. And I'm second to none in my admiration for the fact that the Iraqis voted the way they did and have had the freedom to do so, a freedom guaranteed by American power. As thrilling as that is, I have no confidence that this is an administration that is willing to pay the price, as John F. Kennedy put it, to bear the burden, to make sure that this is carried out in a serious way with long-term implications for the rest of the world. I just don't see any evidence of that. You cannot do that. You cannot take on those ambitions and have a tax cut. Have a tax cut that is going to create deficits for future generations, that's going to make impossible the realization of any major sense of purpose or sense of accomplishment in American life. I'm more of the view that Bush found himself in a situation he couldn't control in Iraq, and has found appropriate Wilsonian language to find an appropriate justification when all the other language he used, weapons of mass destruction and so on, didn't work. Now he's trapped with that language. But the moment there comes a convenient excuse for dumping the commitment, once the expense and the danger and the burden that it would imply becomes clear, I'm pretty sure I know which way he's going to go. I would then say to the party that I'm closer with, the Democratic Party, and the liberal tradition, that in this era when everybody's talking about values and everybody's asking why the Republicans got the value vote, I think the Democrats are absolutely required to speak to American values as well. But that does not mean that one has to pander to Christian conservatives or the religious right. That does not mean that one has to call for Congress to intervene in a family's private business in the state of Florida. What that does mean is that there are great values in American history. The values that Lincoln embodied, the values that Roosevelt embodied. These are enduring values. They are values that I think we as Americans can be proud of. And when we start nominating people for president who can speak to those values instead of passing them over for people who don't, I think we'll have a significant improvement in our political system. That's the basic thrust of my book. Thanks for paying attention to me, and let's talk about it.
Thank you, Alan. We have some time for questions, and this program is being taped and will be streamed on the web on Boston College Front Row, so if you don't want your voice on the web forever, don't ask a question. On the other hand, if you like to hear your voice on the web forever or want to call somebody and tell them you're up there, do ask a question. Barbara, please.
Not because I want my voice on the web, but I did have a question as follow-up to actually what you started talking about, the 2000 election, and the fact that Bradley and McCain didn't actually make it to the nomination by their party. I was curious to what degree you attribute strong leadership to our ability to develop greatness as a nation. In some of your examples, clearly that we had strong leadership at the national level. One might ask whether Bill Bradley and John McCain were up to the task at hand, and maybe that was the failure. National greatness in what you're saying sounds like a national culture that maybe we've lost over the years, and yet it might take a strong leader to instill it in us again.
Well, thanks, Barb. It's a good point, a very good point. I mean, I do think that, I think as a country we've grown uncomfortable with the idea of leadership. Our politics is a kind of anti-leadership politics. We generally think that's good because we think democracy is good, and leadership seems to be alien in some way to democracy. So the way it seems to work now in American politics is that we have very sophisticated focus groups and all these techniques, and we kind of can know almost instantly what's on people's mind, and we can pre-test all these things. And so the politicians, study this very, very carefully. They invest lots of money in framing their messages so that they'll respond to what's on people's minds. And it's become so good at doing that very rarely are mistakes made. There probably was a mistake made with the Terry Schiavo business where the Republicans seemed to kind of get it wrong, where they didn't have time to do their focus groups. They might have learned if they had done that they were going down the wrong path there. But generally speaking, I mean, I'm astonished at how good our politics has become at sort of perceiving every little blip in what's on people's minds and in their own way responding. And isn't that what democracy is about? Isn't democracy about leaders responding to what's on people's minds? And my answer to that question is absolutely not. That's not what democracy is about. Democracy has always required leadership. And Teddy Roosevelt, thought about this a lot, and he wrote about it a lot. The bully pulpit, the idea that presidents would use their office to do essentially what ought to be done that people may not themselves want to have done, but sort of at some deeper level know they have to have done, the kind of things you don't get at in the focus groups. And FDR was very, very successful at that. I mean, it was absolutely essential for the future of our country and for the future of humanity and for the future of my people that Hitler be defeated. And Roosevelt knew that that's not where Americans were at, that focus groups at the time would have picked up all kinds of indications that would have said, well, we're not ready for that. We're not ready to lend Great Britain money. There was furious opposition to lending money to Great Britain for that. And Roosevelt was a leader, and he understood what you had to do. So I think leadership is the kind of missing dimension. And now I don't know whether either McCain or Bradley would have made great leaders. But I know McCain because he just had this aura of someone who embodied that idea of leadership and has shown it, I think, by at least until recently, breaking with his party over things that he felt in the national interest was important to break with him over. I know that Bradley understood this from my conversations with him. Whether he could have actually done it, of course, is another question entirely. But leadership is definitely, it's I think, something we need, but something we resist strongly. He's in charge. Matthew.
As a limey, I will tread cautiously. An observation and a question. The observation is that it seems to me that Catholic social teaching lends itself as much to the greatness tradition as it does to the goodness tradition, in that the commitment to the common good and in economic justice for all, the Bishop's 1986 pastoral letter, there's a commitment to the role of government, the moral role of government to that end. The question is a historical one. I'm curious about the shift that you spoke about, that the Republicans used to be the great guys, now they're the good guys, whereas the Democrats used to be the good guys, but now they're the great guys. A historical question, what explained the shift? Why the shift?
Okay. 2 points then. Well, you're right about the Catholic dimension. I'm thoroughly persuaded. I mean, earlier in the talk, I sort of said how the American idea of goodness was developed in contrast to European decadence. Well, that was Catholic. I mean, read Protestant versus Catholic into that. Now, this is not your Catholicism that you're talking about, the social teachings and the wonderful encyclicals from the latter part of the 19th century. Here I'm talking about the earlier, the Catholic Church with all of its majesty and with all of its closeness to royalty, the Cardinal Richelieu version of Catholicism. But that was certainly part of what the goodness camp in America was, very much a kind of a more Protestant, plain-spoken, less ornate, a priesthood of all believers, Lutheranish kind of ideal. So there is definitely a religious dimension underlying those two. And I think you're right that it also shifts with the shift in Catholic social teachings in the 19th century toward a more welfare statist, corporatist, collectivist, solidaristic ideal. Absolutely. Your point about the shift is also very interesting. I actually was somewhat restrained in my remarks about this, but you may have caught a hint when I suggested that the nomination of two Southerners in 2000, Gore and Bush, may not have been the best thing for the country. You can read my book as an attack on the South. The reason why the party shifted is because the South shifted. The South used to be Democrat. Now the South is Republican. And the South has always been the region in the United States that has been most against the greatness ideal. It's not that the South hasn't brought forth great military figures. They have. It's not that the South is less patriotic. It's actually very patriotic, although I would describe it more as a kind of nationalism than as a kind of patriotism. It's certainly been much more Protestant than Catholic. In some ways, if you're a national greatness person, as I'm trying to be, the South has always been your greatest enemy. And so in the 19th century, even though the South produced such extraordinarily great people, James Madison, John C. Calhoun, I mean, our best thinkers, our great political class emerges out of the South. They are so hindered by slavery, by their necessity to deal with slavery, by either to defend it explicitly, as Calhoun does, or to try to ignore it, that it just destroys what would have been a natural, slavery destroyed what would have been a natural leadership class in the United States. And Marshall, I mean, all of them were tainted with slavery. Then, of course, Lincoln, Illinois, Republican Party, Civil War, slavery is abolished. But, as we all know, a compromise with the South is reached, and segregation is allowed to replace slavery for another 100 years. One of the greatest scandals. The novelist Robert Penn Warren said that the Civil War in the United States began on the day that Lee handed his sword to Grant at Appomattox. We never ended the Civil War in that sense, that the South was allowed to keep its particular institution. And what that meant is for the next 100 years of American history, every time there was an effort to try to create an ideal of national citizenship, to bring the nation together as a unit, it was the South that stood in opposition. Once the Democratic Party, which was the dominant party in the South, realized that the Democrats were shifting ground toward Roosevelt, they slowly, over the course of many years, and then rapidly in the last 20 or 30 years, all went Republican. So if you look at the party composition of the United States, we had a huge change where the South was almost one-party Democratic and is now one-party Republican. But if you look from the goodness-greatness perspective, we've had no change. The South was always for goodness rather than greatness, and when the Democrats embodied that, they embodied it there, and when they didn't, they shifted and they became Republicans. But to me, the greatest enemies of greatness in the United States are almost all, not only from the South, but from the state of Texas. Tom DeLay, Dick Armey, George W. Bush, one after another. It's just, Texas is the biggest problem standing between the United States and greatness.
Yeah, you mentioned as a solution Democrats and Republicans, but about the third parties, they exist too. And they should be heard too. Ideas.
I'm not a third-party person. I have a wonderful, I think it's wonderful, maybe you won't, but I see Ralph Nader, sort of our current third-party person, as very much in the Calhoun tradition, standing for everything small, standing against any kind of sense of national purpose. Now, of course, it could be that we'd have a different kind of third party than the ones we currently have. If that's what it would take, that's what it would take. I mean, Roosevelt himself, who's somewhat the hero, although I'm fully aware of all of Teddy Roosevelt's flaws as a president and as a human being, and I don't try to lionize him in the book at all, but Roosevelt broke with the Republican Party when it had no place for him and ran as a bull moose candidate. So third parties are definitely always there. We are so wedded to a two-party system by the simple fact of having winner-take-all elections and no system of proportional representation in the United States. It's just hard to imagine it's ever going to happen. Richard.
Alan, thanks very much for the comments. And I'll be interested when I look at the book, what you say about the 1960s. Because the 60s is a time that people think of as a moment of transition. And some people think of it as a time when greatness might have reached its limits or hit some limits. some of the proponents of greatness became more interested then in constitutional principles. A kind of constitution worship takes over on the left at that point. I'm not sure when the word liberal became politically a bad term, probably sometime around then. And it's also often said when liberal programs are put forward that they're measured against the 1960s. Things fell apart. They didn't work back then. Would anybody now who put forth a greatness program have to find some answer to what happened in the 1960s and what went wrong?
Thanks for a very perceptive question. I have to talk about this. But I know when liberalism became a dirty word. It actually became a dirty word when a folk singer named Phil Oakes, you remember, sang a song called "Love Me, Love Me, Love Me, I'm a Liberal," which I remember quite well. It was really the first, I remember, it was quite exciting. It was sort of the first, liberal used to be good, and then during the New Left, we were demonstrating in the streets and so on, and we suddenly heard Phil Oakes say liberal with this condescending, dripping way. And I think that was when at least a lot of people on the left started thinking about liberalism as a bad thing. I shared that. I mean, I had my radical period and wrote things at the time about the bankruptcy of liberalism and liberal arrogance. I mean, this was the era that was characterized by the writer David Halberstam as the best and the brightest. And, that term was meant very ironically, that the so-called liberals, the McGeorge Bundys and the Robert McNamara's were really just Cold War managers and morally bankrupt people. And there's certainly an element in a lot of that. I mean, the way in which we went about doing our business in the 1960s as a country, and particularly the way we went about doing our business in Vietnam, is something that we ought to still be ashamed of. I'm not one of those people. There are some. Michael Lind, a friend of mine who writes in similar topics, has written a book saying, well, maybe we were right to go to war in Vietnam. I don't think so. I've never gone in for that kind of revisionism at all. So there's certainly a source of concern for what happened to liberalism during that time. But there's a big but. I do think we have to reevaluate some of the contempt that people of my generation, at least, felt toward the liberalism of that period. I remember because of where I happened to live, that a lot of the demonstrations that I went on in the 1960s were around the New Haven Common. Yale was sort of at the center of a lot of what was going on. I wasn't going to Yale, but I lived not that far away. And the president of Yale, Kingman Brewster, seemed to embody sort of everything that was wrong, managerial, and so on. Well, there's a whole reevaluation of people like Kingman Brewster going on, which I think is a long overdue one. Kingman Brewster opened up Yale to all kinds of groups. George W. Bush never would have even gotten into Yale if Kingman Brewster had come a little earlier. The old sort of gentleman's school and so on, he was in the process of displacing to one that was much more open to all kinds of people. And so some of what, and the other thing, some of the worst, so to speak, of the liberals of that period, like Robert McNamara, did go through a crisis of conscience. Even George Bundy did in his own way. It's hard for me to imagine Tom DeLay ever having a crisis of conscience. I mean, if there's anything to be said for that kind of liberalism over today's kind of conservatism, and I'm serious, that kind of liberalism was maybe aristocratic is the right way, aristocratic enough to admit mistakes, had enough confidence in itself to know that it was wrong and to essentially apologize, something that this current group of people running the country, I believe, will never apologize for, no matter how disastrous the policies. They will never, ever say they were wrong or have a second thought or be motivated by conscience, or any of those things.
I'm going to take two more questions and let Alan go.
Oh, I'm fine.
Are you fine?
I'm fine.
Well, we'll take more questions.
Until people start walking out on me.
Okay, thank you. I'm interested in how your ideas inform our current debate about foreign policy and America's role in the world. And do you think that, consistent with this notion of greatness that you're advocating, that Americans should start to think of this country as an empire? Because the word, empire has been a bad word in American history because of our anti-imperial origins. So I was just curious on your thoughts on this matter.
Well, it's a very valid question, and I don't have an easy answer to it. I have a friend, someone I admire greatly, another writer, Michael Ignatieff, who really basically has answered your question positively. That yes, we have to. I'm not quite as prepared to go that far because I still have my qualms about the whole notion. But I do think that confidence is crucial. We experienced this horrendous attack on September 11th. We could have responded out of fear or out of confidence. Our president wants, I think, us to respond out of fear. I think we would be much better off responding out of confidence. I think if we responded out of confidence, we would have welcomed cooperating with Europe and other countries in the war on terrorism rather than shunning them. Is that more of an empire? I mean, to me, it's much more, it's what I would call a much more global and a much more cosmopolitan foreign policy. Whether it's imperial or not is a question I think I can duck for the moment, because I think it requires, well, let's put it this way. If we're going to, I mean, during the Iranian hostage crisis, the Ayatollah Khomeini denounced us as the great Satan. Now, he got half of it right. I don't think we're Satan, but I think we are a great power. I think it's inevitable that there's just no other power that can rival us. So we can't, the question of are we, if you want to use the word great power rather than empire, that's been answered. We are a great power, maybe even an empire. It's not whether we ought to be, we are. Then the question is how do we manage that well? And I would much rather manage it out of the sense that as a great country, that we're not afraid of our allies, that we're not afraid of working together with others. And I think we'd be much better off. Barb's question about leadership, there was one other thing I think ties in with what you're saying here. I mean, it has to be remembered that no one really thought that Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Delano Roosevelt would become great leaders. Abraham Lincoln was perceived as a minority politician who only got 40% of the vote and was an unsuccessful politician who'd only had one successful election to Congress before he became president. And FDR was widely thought of as just a gentleman playboy who would never be up to the job. Crises happened, and they responded. September 11th was such a crisis. George W. Bush could have become one of the greatest leaders in American history if he had responded to that crisis in ways consonant with the best of America. If he had tried to unify the country rather than to divide it, if he had reached out, I have absolutely no doubt that he would have gone down among the great pantheon of leaders. We, in the past, were very lucky in a sense that when horrible things happened to our country, we had people in office, maybe not the greatest before that crisis, but they responded. It is just a horrible tragedy, in my view, that when this awful, awful thing happened on 9/11, that we had the kind of response we had. It was a moment when Americans, you all remember what happened. We all wanted to come together. Everybody felt a sense of unity. All of a sudden, people were saying, it doesn't matter whether you're gay or you're straight. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, Republican or Democrat. We are all Americans. And then to have that, replaced by the divisive politics of culture war is just, it's a scandal. And it literally makes me, it brings tears to my eyes of what this country could have been like after September 11th and what it became instead. Sermon, not a lecture. Sermon. Homily. How about 1, 2, 3, and then we can, all right.
I'm a visitor to your country who was here during your election. I'm a bit surprised by the suggestion that even America, you've always got this choice between goodness and greatness. It seems to me that during this recent election, I mean, it's a bit like talking to the UK and saying, well, do they have a choice between goodness and greatness between Blair and Howard? It's a nonsense comparison. And it seems to me that more the comparison here was, the goodness of Bush over against the sort of pragmatic and more inclusive goodness of Kerry. But it's not as if the people were presented with a choice between goodness and greatness.
I don't think they were. I think you're right. I do think, however, that Kerry had instincts in that direction. There's a lot of talk now that because Kerry lost, that he made so many mistakes. I've actually never shared that. I think Kerry ran a great campaign myself. I mean, I know this isn't the opportunity, it's long gone, but I think Kerry achieved moments of greatness during the campaign. I think he spoke in great ways. I think he was actually moving. I was moved. I think he was subject to one of the most unfair campaigns a politician has ever had to respond to, and he dealt with it with great dignity. He made mistakes, but all candidates do. I think Kerry, in his own way, really was offering a prospect. So I slightly disagree with you. I think we did have a choice, and we chose, in my view, we chose the wrong way to do it. Democracy, you kind of have, what can you do? But I think we chose it out of fear. It was like many others, I'm sure, who share my political sympathies. 2004 was a very hard result to swallow. I was in Europe for the whole fall semester in Berlin, and I was all going before the election, Kerry's going to win, Kerry's going to win, and it was just, I didn't want to appear in public for a week. Unfortunately, I was scheduled to be on every television program and media interview, but I didn't want to do it. It was really hard, and but I do think we have more of a choice.
I'm hard pressed. I can't use this. I'm hard pressed to reconcile what you're saying about goodness and greatness, and your responses to the young man who asked you candidly, aren't you really talking empire?
Mm-hmm.
And I suggest, I graduated from here 62 years ago, and at that time,
The year I was born.
well, I'm now one of the patriarchs. I've been a practicing trial lawyer all that time. That's my background. Yours is historian. I've read a lot of history. I've attended to a lot of political conventions in my time. I came to know Harry Truman and Dick Daley, Bill Bradley. Harry Truman is the only person, in my view of history, who was a great man because he admitted who he was. Mm-hmm. He was a party politician who was never corrupted by the party. And if you remember, when he went to bed in California, and they said, Dewey won, he said, have they counted Cook County yet? The quintessential political operative next to Abraham Lincoln, who without debate Bill Clinton, because he went from northern Illinois, as you know, down to southern Illinois, constantly changing his position on slavery, to the point where he said, the only thing that separates, he's not as great a man as Senator Douglas or myself. I don't mean that. The black is entitled to eat the bread that he works for. And that's all he gave him at that time. Then he developed greatness. Now, empire, I suggest, Professor, contrary to what you're saying, was part and parcel of this continent. We took over in the Mexican War, we added 1/3 of our land mass, as I remember. Is that correct, roughly?
No, I think, as I said, my point was that because of our size and because of our power, this is a status that we have, and that was my response to his question. So,
Power. We had
perhaps, I'm
I don't mean
I'm hoping to hear a question.
I
No.
understand what's going on in the school today. I know how I listened 62 years ago.
Yeah.
I never heard any talk like this. We recognized that we were a continent of great wealth, and we circumscribed the Monroe Doctrine, the first steel wall around this whole continent. And then we took over Roosevelt took everything. Teddy, we used to call him Roosevelt. He took over the battle with Spain and destroyed Spain.
All right.
And he went to Asia. And we're now in the present year 20.
Is there a question, sir?
Current scholars who are writing on
Is there a question? I'm sorry to.
I can hear you. Yes. The question is dialogue.
Okay.
I don't mean to sit in any audience and absorb what someone's saying without challenging.
Fine, I'm glad you did.
That the greatness that you're talking about is empire.
Okay. I think we're in agreement. As I said, I think, I think I was making very much the same point you were trying to make, and that was that we have, for all kinds of reasons, this status as whether you want to call it an empire or not, we have great power status, and the question is, as I said, how we manage it. Go ahead, Grace.
I just have a quick question about one thing. When we're thinking about the principles that the Republican Party was founded on, we think of the principle of subsidiary and local governance and decisions that are made at local levels, less government, associations, town hall meetings, those sorts of things. I wonder what about that made America good, or what about that made America great, and how come the Republican Party is less focused on the principle of subsidiary today than it was when it was established?
Well, I'm not sure it is. I think at least there are certain parts of the Republican Party talk in a language that sounds like subsidiarity. It's currently called federalism, and it's embodied in groups like the Federalist Society, which is a conservative and Republican-oriented legal group. And a lot of what they say is decisions should be made at the local level. The more local, the better. That's not quite, I think, what Catholics mean by subsidiarity, because what I think they really mean by it is the idea that at the local level, corporate influence can be much more powerful than it can be at the national level, and they tend to view the national government as pursuing economic regulation and reforms that they don't want, so they feel that they can do better at the local level. But they certainly use language like that. So I think that's what's essentially happened. It's kind of been co-opted for economic purposes primarily.
Okay, we're going to call it to a close. Thank you, Alan Wolfe.
Oh, thank you.